Welcome to Breaking Down Patriarchy. I'm Amie McPhie Allebest. Have you ever felt stared at? Have you ever been followed? Have you ever felt unsafe in your own neighborhood or even in your own home? Today, we're talking about fear and specifically about stalking. As the feminist scholar Pumla Jacola once wrote, patriarchy runs on fear: fear of being an outsider, fear of being brutalized, fear of being too much, too inadequate, too vocal, or too different. I'd be willing to bet that many of you listening right now have felt these types of fear and the social control that flows from them. I know I have. So, to help us explore this relationship between patriarchy and fear, as well as violence, colonialism, white supremacy, and more, we're going to turn to the work of a fabulous essayist, Amie Souza Reilly, who wrote a book about her experience living through 943 days of stalking and aggression, all taking place in and around her own house. The book is titled Human Animal, a Bestiary in Essays. It's a beautifully crafted, haunting account of living through years of harassment, of constant pressure, and routines of violation. But it's also a book of reflections, a dissection of language, a beautifully illustrated questioning of our culture, and ultimately, an indictment of the fear which patriarchy thrives on. And I'm so excited to be discussing this book today with the author, Amie Souza Reilly. Welcome, Amie.
Amie, thank you so much for having me.
Amie Souza Reilly is a visual artist and multi-genre writer from Connecticut. Her work has appeared in various journals, including Wigleaf, Had, The Chestnut Review, The Atticus Review, Catapult, Smoke Long Quarterly, Barron, Pigeonholes, and elsewhere. She holds an MA in English Literature from Fordham University and an MFA from Fairfield University, and is the writer in residence and director of writing studies at Sacred Heart University. So, again, Amie, thanks for being here. Welcome. And I'm wondering if you can start us off by introducing yourself to us a little bit more personally. Tell us where you're from, where you grew up, what brought you to your writing, and maybe eventually you can get to the subject of the book, how you first ended up living in the situation where the book unfolds.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I'm a lifelong Connecticut resident. I mostly grew up here in a really small town in what's known as the Valley, so an inland portion of Connecticut. Even though we stayed mostly in one town, we moved around a ton. I lived in that same town in like 5 or 6 different houses. And then I moved to the town where the books events take place after my undergrad, so in the early 2000s, and have lived there ever since. And the house where all of those events take place is the house that I bought after I got married in 2014. And it's right in the downtown section. And we ended up there because my husband and I were both commuting into New York City. So it was walkable to the train. And that was kind of our like big selling point. It's a really charming little old house. It was really close to where my son would eventually go to school, and seemed really idyllic at the time.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Um, I'm wondering if, well, let's see how I want to do this. As we've already mentioned, the story that you share in the book is a story about stalking, about being stalked. So maybe let's start with some basic definitions. What constitutes stalking? And then maybe bring us into the book and kind of explain the situation that you found yourself in.
Yeah. I mean, I think stalking is one of those words that we kind of throw around a lot. But I think what it really boils down to for me is thinking through ideas about consent. Like stalking would just be following in a way that lets the person who you are following um, know that you're trying to scare them or intimidate them. There's certainly nothing accidental about it. I think it's, putting somebody else in a position where there's a power imbalance, um, and that even if a boundary is established, or even a kind of like understood social contract is breached in some way that isn't consensual, that would move us from like just a coincidence of following to a sort of more violent understanding of stalking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great definition. And actually, maybe before we get to the actual situation that you found yourself in, I maybe we'll talk about fear a little bit more generally. At near the beginning of the book, you write, and I'll just quote you. You say, "I'm a woman who often feels afraid around men. My fear is gut deep, learned through culture and history, and also from my mother." So maybe let's unpack that first, that kind of underlying fear that maybe predates this event that you write about, or ongoing event that you write about in the book. If you could tell us more about this fear of men from culture and history, and also from your mother, how are these lessons being taught to you throughout your life?
I love this question because it was making me think a lot about what happened, or the sort of like childhood experiences that I hadn't really thought about too deeply when all of this was happening with our neighbors. It was, I certainly wasn't thinking about like, well, when I grew up. Um, but sort of thinking about this right now made me remember all of these like the stranger danger kinds of
Mm,
conversations that we had growing up.
hmm
I was born in 1979, so definitely a young child in the 80s, but have like really clear visceral memories of like kids on milk cartons. Um, and there was this, and I looked it up recently. There was this PSA. It was like a short little commercial that was put out by the American Medical Association with a little girl like standing on a sidewalk in a beautiful suburban neighborhood. And this big car rolls up, and this man rolls down the window and is like, "Come in, I have candy." And I remember that being part of watching Saturday cartoons.
mm,
Um, and I mean, my mom and my friends' moms were all this same way. Like, if I were to walk down the street to a friend's house, I had to call when I got there, so she knew I was safe. And we didn't go anywhere alone. We did not answer the phone if our parents were home, or if we did answer the phone, we didn't tell them that our parents weren't home. Like
hmm
up until I was in my late teens. Um, there's a really great article by Paul. What is his last name? Paul Crenshaw and Salon from a couple years ago, where he talks about this sort of like children of the 80s and this stranger danger and like what it was to grow up in that period. And um, I think I mean, that hasn't stopped. I mean, people younger than me, I think, would have those kinds of thoughts, but also it's, like mass shootings and people driving
mm,
cars in crowds. And I think we just sort of exist in this culture of fear. So I think, when I was trying to consider the ways I understood fear, it kind of came back to those ideas
mm,
from way back, in like the America's Most Wanted TV shows that we watched as kids, and this sort of like, something bad could happen.
hmm
It's always
Yeah,
sort
me too. I'm the same. I'm basically the same age as you are, and I recall the same things. And yeah, I know that some people our age like had more of a free range childhood of like playing night games and running around and just going home when the street lights came on or whatever. Like there were people like that, but that my upbringing was much more like yours. My mom needed to know where I was at every moment. She was very, very, very afraid of us being kidnapped. And I'll add like a gender piece. I don't know if this resonates for you too, but I remember, yes, always being on alert of like I could be kidnapped any second. And it was definitely always by men. And in fact, I think I remember like being told if you feel like you're in danger, look for a woman who looks like she's a mom, right? Like, because women, so the message was women are safe and men are unsafe. That's definitely something that I absorbed through my childhood.
Yeah, I remember that too. And yeah, and that it seemed so natural and normal
hmm
that
Well,
way.
and it's kind of backed up by data, not kind of, it is backed up by data, right? Like, yeah.
Yeah, and I remember thinking, being like a 12, 13, 14-year-old teenager and thinking like my mom was overreacting, but like when I was 8, a guy drove up to our bus stop pantsless, like,
Oh, no.
and like so like the thing that we were afraid of did happen.
Yeah.
Um and I don't think I think I was older before I put those two things together, but like
Mm,
even so she wasn't even able to protect us, and
yeah.
all of these things that our moms did to try to protect us didn't work. I mean, my sister was with me, so we all of her like always go somewhere with your sister.
Yeah.
We're still vulnerable kids, and so I don't know. There's a strange tension between like there is that sort of nostalgia that I hear people say about, like going out and playing until the streetlights came on. But I don't think it was that easy. There was that fear in there. And as much as I think now, like, I don't want my son to look back and think like, well, my mom was always afraid, but also like, maybe you should be.
Mm-hmm.
Things do happen.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a tricky balance to know how to parent your kids to be cautious and safe, but not unduly terrified all the time.
Yeah.
Okay. So after writing about your mom and your childhood, you write, I anticipate feeling afraid or at least wary in meeting rooms and in bars and on elevators and in parking garages because these are places where I have been shouted at, leered at, groped, and followed. Um, I'd, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to tell us about those experiences, maybe kind of getting older in your life. And sadly, I'm sure many listeners will be able to relate to those.
I mean, I don't want to delve deeply into some kind of like myriad of traumas
Mm-hmm.
and fall to pieces on your show, but I think that I'm really interested. I mean, I'm interested in this sort of understanding that people are going to relate to that because it is ubiquitous, I
Yep.
think, in some ways. That fear and panic of what is possible, like that doesn't go away. And there needs to be a certain awareness everywhere that we go, I think. I mean, I think that there's just this sort of inherent understanding that non-men have about the physical presence or the potential, like the always like the violence, the potential of violence that is there when there's a man in the room, is something that isn't just taught to us by our mothers, but is also a real thing and is something. Let me answer this question with an anecdote that I think might get me closer to what I'm thinking through. But I just did a reading of this book at this amazing coffee house in New Haven. And it was a very small group of folks that I already knew. It was a very cool way to do a reading where, like, I don't know, it felt more like a conversation. And so it was a mix of people I know from work and from teaching and from different art spaces, and it was moderated by a really dear friend of mine who I met during grad school, who's a man. And he was asking me questions about violence and art and questions that were natural and organic to come up when reading this. Um, but there was a very, like, all of a sudden there was this clear gap. And this woman in the audience, who was a wonderful, very close friend of mine, was like, the thing is, I think that women would read this book and they don't need anything else explained.
Mm.
And that men, unbeknownst to them, have never really had to think about what happens when you walk into a room. And the whole room got really silent for a minute. And it was like, and then all of a sudden the women in the room all kind of like nodded and said like, this whole book just makes sense to me and puts words to experience. And my friend, the moderator, and a couple other men who were there were like, well, I'm not sure. I still don't think I understand it fully. And I think there's just enough of like an electricity in the room. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that men are necessarily aware of our understanding that violence is all like could always happen,
Mm-hmm.
because if they don't think that they are possible of have the possibility to bring that violence, then why would that be something that crosses their mind? So it was really interesting to sort of um, see that unfold in real time and understand that, like, a colleague, if a colleague comes up to me in the copy room and I don't know he's there right away, I always jump.
Mm.
And countless times that's happened, and like the man will laugh. And my heart is racing, even though it's somebody I've known for decades.
Mm.
And I think that that's that kind of ingrained fear that is part of this whole patriarchal culture that we're so entrenched in.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that anecdote. I do think so many listeners will relate to that. And I've had conversation. I mean, it took years with even my husband for us both to realize that gap, I think, where we would have conversations and just kind of miss each other. And it did take years for me to realize, like, oh, I do have, like, I didn't even know what I was carrying around, let alone that I would need to explain it to him, because he had no idea, just absolute oblivion. And that's part of the privilege that of just like being a man walking around. Like, you don't have to think about it and you don't realize anybody else does. So yeah, thanks
Yeah,
for walking us through that.
that's so true.
So now let's have you bring us into the book and maybe explain the situation that you found yourself in. How did you end up in the scenario that you write about? And at what point did you realize that boundaries were being crossed?
So my husband and I got married. It was my second marriage. And we both lived in different parts of the same town, and we knew we wanted to kind of start over and start fresh. So we chose, we looked at a bunch of houses, and like this one was just, like when you meet a person and they make you feel good, like walking in
Mm-hmm.
the house was just like, oh, this is so charming and sweet. So we bought the house, we started to move in, we were bringing our things in, and looking back now, I'm sure anybody who goes through any kind of like long, like drawn out traumatic event says, like, looking back, I should have known better. But like looking back, we should have known better. Right after we signed the papers for the house, the real estate agent was like, oh, you should probably know that the guys who live next door, they don't really live there. They own the house, but they also live somewhere else. But when they're around, they're a little weird, but they're mostly harmless. And we were like, okay, like neighbors are strange. And then when we met the people who we had bought the house from, like they wanted to meet for drinks, which I thought was just like cool and neighborly.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but looking back now, it was their way of warning us. They
Mm-hmm.
just kind of said something similar to what the real estate agent said, which was just like, you might want to keep your distance from them. They're a little bit odd. Um, and then once we moved in, the woman next door was like, oh, has anybody filled you in on those guys next door? And I was like, what is, like, little kind of hairs on the back of my neck started to stand up, but I don't know. I kind of really at that point believed in the sort of like unspoken social codes of living, in the suburbs. Um, and then I think it started to, like, we knew we were in trouble when one of the brothers followed my husband on his morning commute. So like they were on the same train and he was sitting behind him and he was talking about us on his phone. And even that at the time, we were like, well, maybe, lots of people take the train. Thousands of people take the train. This could just be a coincidence. And he's just like a weird dude who's talking about his new neighbors. And then they were in our backyard. Like, we didn't have a fence when we first moved in. And I looked out the back windows and they were just like standing there with their lawnmower. And then we found out that they had been like rifling through our trash. And that's when we were like, okay, well, this is definitely more than just a little strange, but mostly harmless. Something's up here. But we knew, like, we were in. We couldn't get out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as much of the story as you're willing to talk about, and I would suggest that readers buy the book and read it, and and so you don't need to give away all the spoilers. But if you're willing to share some of the story, that would be it's a really instructive and fascinating and kind of horrifying story.
Okay, so we moved in. We were, my son was 6, so he was going to first grade. I had just gotten into graduate school. My husband also worked in the city, so he and I were both commuting on different trains from Connecticut into Manhattan. Um, we were just kind of starting over. And after the trash can and the lawn mowing started to happen, they would stand. We shared a driveway, which, it was like one big paved space. So whenever we were in the driveway, if they were home, they would also start to, come out of their house and stand in the driveway. And there would just be a lot of sort of subtle ways for them to let us know that they were looking us up, or like new information about us that we hadn't told them. So Like I would be leaving and one of them would use my middle name and
Mm.
like call me by my full first, which is not, I mean, it's public record, but it's just not something that you do. So a lot
No,
of
it's
the,
weird.
yeah, the uncanny, uneasy feeling was just like, this is just not something that people do. Um, but it's not inherently illegal or wrong or even like outwardly violent. My mom did a lot of babysitting for us back then. So they learned my mom's schedule and then they would start calling her by name, which again, like if you do enough Google research, you can find out who my mom is. But what a strange thing. Um, because we are all, creatures of habit, they learned our schedule fairly quickly. So they knew what days I was going to school and would show up at the times that I would leave so that they would pull in as I was leaving. Um, they said a lot of really strange things about like, well, we knew you were nice people because we saw the way you decorated your old house, which was just like, we didn't live together. So I wasn't even sure whose house they had looked into, but like both of us were selling houses, so it could have just been an open house thing. And I mean, I'm also guilty of going into my neighbors' houses when there's an open house and a house is for sale because I'm nosy too. So there was a lot of like room for interpretation and a lot of me trying to convince myself that I was overreacting.
Mm-hmm.
Um, until I wasn't. And then there was um, I think like again, without by the book, I don't want to give it
Mm-hmm.
too much, but there was a moment where I was leaving with my son in the car and I was just in a rush and I didn't want to deal. So I didn't say hello when they started like shouting their hellos. So one of them came around and when we got back and he trapped me in my car and he wouldn't let me open the door and wouldn't let us out, and just shouting about what a terrible mother I was and what a rude person I was, and how could anybody like me raise a child? And that was kind of the scariest, I think, and that kind of the moment where I was like, I have no idea how we're going to get out of this, but we need to get out of this situation. It's gone way beyond just strange.
Yeah. In the book, you also quote Pumla Jacola saying that fluency in fear and making us police ourselves is how women are kept in check. So I think that is such an important idea. So I'd love for you to help unpack that for us. How is fear used to control women, and who or what is creating that fear?
Um, This is such a good book. It's called Fear Factory. It's excellent. Everybody should read it. But I mean, I don't think it's just women, but I do think that women do kind of universally fear this, and I think it's just like fear is used to control people in all kinds of spaces. And I think in order to kind of unpack what she's saying, it's really useful to think about power. Because if women are afraid of men, then men can maintain or regulate the power that they already have.
Yep.
Um, and I mean, it could be like in this situation with the neighbors that like keeping me afraid of them, let them do whatever they wanted. They walked through our yard. They continued to like terrorize other neighbors. They continued to shout because they knew I was afraid and I wasn't going to do anything about it. But I think about how like all of the spaces where we can be afraid, and how that maintains some sort of level of, primarily white straight men holding power, happens in all kinds of different ways. Like if you are afraid you're going to lose your job, then you're going to do whatever it is that, whoever is above you is, to keep you in check at work. Um, and of course, there's all kinds of ways that this overlaps with race and class, and the ways that, if you are afraid, you will stay in line and do what it is that those people in power expect. I was just reading this really interesting article about the return to, and maybe this is something since we're the same age. Like I remember in the 90s when there was so much pressure on us to be so skinny and like
Mm,
Britney Spears was considered chubby and this like all of this body stuff and how that's coming back,
yep.
and how that's connected to fear and power. And if the media says that women need to be skinny again, then it shows a sort of masculine dominance over our bodies. So I think it's just, um, one of many tools of, the oppressor to keep people out from these sort of powerful spaces.
Yeah, for sure. And that leads me to another question, which we kind of hit on before, of like how we should teach our kids and that balance of like wanting them to be safe and cautious, but not scaring them. And so if we take this like in a gendered direction, um, we need to teach specifically like teach girls like to be wary and be able to keep themselves safe. But um, the book has me asking the question, does teaching girls to be afraid of men actually make us safer, or how can we teach girls and women to be safe without reinforcing patriarchal fear and control? Because like in the example of these brothers that were kind of like psychologically terrorizing you, they wanted you to be scared, right? And so then if we are teaching girls and women to be scared of men, does that just reinforce what they're wanting and reinforce that patriarchal structure?
I mean, I think it does. And then we're stuck in that same balance of like, be careful, but don't limit yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think and maybe this is because I'm the mom of a son, but I think that, if we're gonna settle on these sort of like gender essential ideas of bringing up our children, I think it comes down to consent. And instead of, I mean, if it were possible to, maybe this isn't like a, if, either or, but more like a both and, um, we need to teach consent from like the very beginning and not wait until like teenagers and, the sex talk happens. But like consent is something that I think should be taught right away. And all touching needs to be asked. You have to get an okay first. And if something doesn't feel good, then you need to, like, saying something. If somebody tells you, I don't like that, I don't like when you touch my hair, then like that needs to be something that children are allowed to and encouraged to do. And then, I mean, the adults need to follow through and listen. And I think if we can maybe think through less about like teaching via like these gender roles and more just the sort of like basic, how much space are we taking up and how can we listen and take care of each other in a consensual way, then, I mean, it's not going to go away. And then, I mean, certainly this all sounds like a utopia that is impossible, but I don't know. I think a lot, my son is 17 now, so I'm like, I watch him and wonder like, what is his life like outside of my house and what have we done, and what is he thinking about as he moves through the world. And if there's anything I hope he has is this sort of like understanding that there's a respect that is necessary regardless of gender. And I think it's so important to teach, like, I feel exhausted a little bit of the like, how are we going to protect our girls, when I'm really like, can't we just teach our boys better?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that might be more what I would hope would happen. Like, how can I make sure my son knows that when he walks into a room full of women, he is a potential for violence, even though I know that he's a good kid and that that's not something that, I think would happen. I need him to know that the girls in his classroom might be afraid.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I want him to know that, like, if somebody says, I don't like that, then that's the end of that conversation. And then it's not just about bodies, but language. If somebody says, like, please don't call me that, then it's not hard to not call somebody that,
Mm-hmm.
whatever that might be. So I think maybe we're allowing boys to sort of inherit this or move through the world with this sense of power and privilege. Um, And I think that maybe we should show them that exists really early on.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I think just the awareness, like we said, so that they're not getting to like be full adults and married to a woman before they realize that's maybe how the girls around them feel. Like they should know that in school when they're just realizing just the historical precedent, the physical differences, and what might, so that they can be active allies. That's right. Instead of just like, wow, I don't even know how I'm affecting other people. Just, it's occurring to me too how important it is, like you said, to, regardless of gender, just no matter who it is, that people know how to set boundaries and say what they're really feeling. And be able to feel empowered in situations where maybe if they start to feel afraid because there's a physical threat, no matter who it is, right? That they have the tools to stand up for themselves, that they can recognize a power dynamic and call it out or whatever. Just empowering everyone to ask for what they need and to never accidentally or purposely, obviously, harm, even psychologically, another person, right? Just
Yeah,
teaching everybody the tools.
exactly.
Um, Okay, so I'm wondering another question too. I'm just thinking like from somebody else reading the book, maybe a skeptical. I'm envisioning like a man who's skeptical and who might say like, well, the in your specific situation, the men who were stalking you and kind of terrorizing you, they actually never physically hurt you. They never laid hands on you. So you're overreacting or you're exaggerating. How would you respond to those sorts of arguments? And why do you describe the brother's actions as violent, a form of violence?
Um, this hasn't happened yet, so I'm hoping it never happens. And I hope that the version of, if it does happen, that the version of me, um, who this happens to, has the wherewithal to just walk away
Yeah.
and not entertain that question at all. But I am really curious about like, when did we decide that? First, I mean, I guess first and foremost, it's like, can't we just please believe women when they say that they're scared, and that fear is a tool of power, and power and violence are inextricably connected.
Yep.
Um, and like, why does it have to physically hurt before it counts as some kind of violence? And I mean, one of the things that nobody has said this to me post book, but we did several times try to call the police, which was such a complicated thing to do because I knew they weren't going to do anything.
Mm.
But I think, and I mean, there wasn't anything they could do. If the police came out to our house, then the brothers were usually gone by then. But
Mm.
because they hadn't actually touched me, every time it was, well, what do you want me to do? What do you think I can do about this? If they're not doing anything, and a lot of times they would be on their property line, which is also complicated and a weird thing to think about in terms of like land and division. But if they were shouting at us from their side, then there really was nothing wrong except that everything was wrong.
Mm.
Um, so I think it's really complicated to think about like what constitutes violence. But I mean, maybe going back to the conversation we just had about consent, like I'm saying this doesn't feel great and I am afraid and I shouldn't feel that way at home, um, should be enough, but it never is. Everybody's looking for some kind of proof. Um, but if we look at any kind of statistics about domestic violence, all of the non-visual or non-physical things that lead up to that, like if we could listen, then we could stop the physical part from ever happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. I'm just thinking back to my own life and times that I was bullied and again, like psychologically, um, yeah, tormented. And it is so damaging. Like that fear is very, very real, whether or not the person ever, it's different if the person like crosses a physical boundary, but even just that, like that terrorizing of you mentally is terribly traumatizing. But you're right. I mean, it's just so hard. If there's no bruise, if there's no physical mark, then people don't take it seriously. It's so upsetting.
I think when you're the one who's afraid, like I'm thinking about this more too, but like my physical reaction is the same whether I feel like somebody's gonna like
Yeah.
actually punch me in the mouth or just like say horrible things to me. Like
Yep.
it's the same kind of sweaty. shaky feeling. So,
Yep.
like, our physical reaction is the same, even if theirs is not.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. And that leads me to the next question too, because you mentioned the incident. I think it was the first one where it was your husband that was followed on the train, and they were stalking and terrorizing your husband as well. But that there was the effect was really different, and you call it gender based um, violence in the book. The violences were gender based violences. So can you talk about that a little bit more? The link of you know fear and violence in a patriarchal society, and how it was gender based when your husband was experiencing it also.
Yeah. I mean, if we're thinking about patriarchal structures, then like you can't remove the gender part of that, right? So maybe in a way, there's probably a way to look at or examine all violence as it relates to gender. But I think I mean, I don't want to say like it's so interesting, but because it's also just awful. But when so they followed my husband on the train, and he um, thought it was strange for sure. And he called me from the office, and he was like, you know, Wes was behind me on the train, and this is what he said. And I remember asking him later, like, "Were you scared?" And he was like, "No,"
Mm-hmm.
which is so interesting because it shows like his male privilege. But then later on, we were trying to get a restraining order because it seemed like the only way that we could make anything happen, even though like even that was like this is just going to be a piece of paper and we're going to end up in the same place. But it would have shown that we had done something um, to s- to get this behavior to stop. So we put security cameras in, which was wildly expensive when we did it. And I was like ethically opposed to watching my neighbors, but also like terrified that something bad was going to happen. So we installed these security cameras on our front porch, and this was like pre Ring camera on the doorbell, so they were like facing our shared driveway, and um, it's impossible not to see them. It's like um, a big mechanism, big eyeball. So when the brothers pulled up and they saw it, I was inside watching it on the TV, which is also just a very strange sort of reality.
Yeah.
And my husband pulled up and they immediately attacked him by saying, essentially by saying, like, you must think I'm very sexy and you want to look at me. Turning the camera into this like voyeuristic, pornographic eye instead of a surveillance and safety feature. So their whole argument was not like you can't do that or you can't record us. It was what are you doing with this footage? And like you must have a crush on me. You must be in love with me. And it, of course, in the moment I was just like, what is happening? But if I when I step back and think about it academically and trying to make sense of it, that was just a way of using like heteronormative gender roles against him to try to make my husband feel small. It didn't work, and he was very much like, "No, dude, like you got to stop walking around on our property." Um, but it's in any instance that they could maintain their power, they're using all of the tools that we know. So it's they're going to attack my husband's masculinity, but they would also do it with like money and class things. Like they knew they knew how much money we spent on our house and they knew what we did for jobs. And they had this sort of general understanding about our finances, which again, like in some ways, a public record, but in another way, it's just like not something that you do.
No, it's super
Um,
weird.
Super weird. So they would say things to us about money, like how much they had offered on the house and how much more that was than what we paid for it. And that they knew people who lived, they knew all the people who lived in our house before because they'd been there for so long. And that 2 families ago, there was a bathroom renovation and they didn't have a lot of money. So the brothers bought their sink. So they would like constantly say, like, we paid for that sink in your downstairs bathroom. That sink is still there. And I think about it like every day. Just so like all of the ways that they could assert some level of dominance in all of the sort of categories that we think about these like the intersectionality of race and class and gender certainly happened, but it was like, now that I look back on it, I can watch when it switched. Like,
Mm.
when are they going to use class, or when are they going to use gender, and what ways are they thinking about my my feminine body versus like my husband's masculinity? It's all power.
Yeah, it's all power. Exactly. And this is one thing that I love about this is it's just so brilliant that you had this really awful experience, but then you've used it as a meditation on and a way to understand all of these really interesting systems of power. And you expand it beyond where I think people would expect you to be able to even find, you know, analogs and resonance in these really brilliant ways. And one of the things that you write is you say, as I spin outward to grasp at all the ways my experiences are part and parcel to the whole history of white patriarchal settler violence, it is not enough to wear a feminist lens. So you're not just, like you said, you're not just talking about gender and feminism, you're talking about class and race. And then you mention white settler violence. Could you break that down for us a little bit further?
Yeah, I mean, I think that thinking I had such a hard time with we had to get a fence. We had to put a physical boundary between them and us. And I think that's when I first started to really consider what what that meant, and like ownership over land.
Yeah.
Um was odd. Like, we had to call the city, and the city had to come out with all these like measuring tapes and things, and there had been a fence there once before, and somebody took it down, and they had to okay it with all of these other neighbors, and all of it, like, it's all made up. It's just all pretend. Somebody 150 years ago divided that land up into parcels, and that somebody was most definitely a white guy,
Mm-hmm.
who was doing it for money. And like, none of this land belongs to any of us. And I have some piece of paper from a bank that says that now it's mine, but like, no, it isn't. Um, and who am I? And I think it was just such a struggle for me to feel both like I need these dudes out of my yard, and also like, well, it's not even really my yard anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm going to think about them as part of this, a symptom of, white settler violence, then like, I'm a white woman. I have lineage that goes back to those very first British colonizers. Like, I'm part of this system that created this, and also harmed by it. Um, and I still don't really know how to wrestle with that, and I don't think I should. Like, I don't think there should be a resolution to that, just something to constantly sit with. Um, but like, their obliviousness to their sort of white male dominance, I think makes it almost easier for me to see both, like, where I'm complicit in it and also harmed by it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's really important to see that. And a lot of people miss that, right? They don't ask that question. And it is kind of absurd when it's all stolen land for us to be, yeah, measuring and dividing. It's like, yes, those are very much settler constructs. So I appreciate you bringing that to the foreground too. Okay, switching gears. This is also a book about language. And again, you go in all of these really fascinating directions. You write about the boundaries between human animals and non human animals, and Native Americans would call them more than human relatives, right? And you write about names specifically. You write that, quote, not all acts of naming are gentle. When Swedish botanist, zoologist, taxonomist, and physician Carl Linnaeus dubbed human animals mammals in the 18th century, despite the fact that only half of us can lactate, he did so in part because he was involved with a campaign to outlaw wet nursing, which in turn would keep women in the home. I did not know that. And I thought that was so interesting. So I'm wondering if you can expand on that idea a bit further and tell us more about your interest in naming and in animal names in particular. And even your title, it's the Bestiary was the framework that you were drawn to tell the story. So can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I learned about that in a book called Nature's Body, The Gendered History of Science, I think is the subtitle. Uh, and the whole thing is fascinating. And it made me think a lot about like, you know, I teach writing, so I spend my time thinking about language in lots of different ways. And something that I want my undergrads to think about is like how their identity impacts the language they use. And this is another example, like not for in this Linnaeus example, it's not for good, but like we have this whole system of thought that we organize our whole, European American classification system on this one guy who was just like involved in this kind of side gig. Um, and how many like we all do that in various ways. And I was really interested in that because it seemed accidental. Like
Hmm.
this was just sort of coincidence that he was doing these two things, but now so much relies on that. And even the idea of classification was really complicated because like that's just more rules that are made up. But I also understood the need to organize things. And I think like the bestiary structure made sense to me in a lot of different ways. I think even as a kid, I was always really drawn to thinking about animals or drawing animals or like writing about animals and like wanting, I mean, I think a lot of kids go through the like, I want to be a veterinarian thing, but I wanted to be a veterinarian like in the way that made my heart hurt. And I would
Hmm.
think about it all the time. And I wanted so badly to be like to touch a deer. Like I just wanted to like those were
Hmm.
things that I thought about a lot, always. Um, and then sort of reading about Linnaeus and thinking about Linnaeus and classifications and like what does that mean? And like reading Derrida and thinking like, well, like why do we need to name animals and what is that about control?
Hmm.
Um, and I had written about naming in a different project. I've always hated the way my name is spelled. I've always been jealous of Amy's like you.
Oh, no.
Oh, you're doing it correctly. My parents spelled my name wrong, but, like, I never got a cool vanity license plate.
Uh,
Um, and I like, it was always just kind of interesting to me that, like, I was born and then my parents were like, "We're gonna call this wiggly little creature this thing," and that, like, I'm stuck with it forever.
mhm.
I mean, there are legal ways to change it, but like is that a gift or a blessing? And then like that's also coded in violence if we think about
Mm.
like enslaved women who didn't get to keep their children or like lost their names and lineage and then sort of both of my husbands, my first husband and my second husband have the same last name,
Oh,
which is
wow.
just weird, right? Just strange.
Mm.
A weird coincidence, but like I remember like, I took my first husband's last name because I had had an estranged relationship with my father, and I didn't want that name anymore. I've since kind of taken it back. But, like, when I was thinking about that in my late 20s, I was like, "I really just want my own name." Like,
Yeah.
I just wanna make something up.
Yeah.
So I
Instead of
think
choosing between men,
right,
like,
like,
which
this sort
man's
of
name do I
dude, like, I wanted to, like, what and what do I don't know. So there's all this kind of ownership and naming, and that kind of quickly crossed over to animals.
Mhm.
Um, and so I think the bestiary form, it's just cool. Like, it's just such a cool way of thinking through how we got here and, like, what do we how we use art to understand the world. Like, the illustrations of medieval bestiaries are so weird
Mhm.
and delightful and, like, cross all these boundaries between reality and fantasy, and partially that's because, like, there's no way that somebody in, you know, the hills of England would know what a zebra looked like, but also because, like, there was nobody there to, like, check their reality, and, like, unicorns and mermaids were included, and that's really interesting to me. Um, so I found that form to be kind of a comfort, but also again, like, but this is also a complicated structure and riddled with power and um, but it's also a catalog, and I don't know, I had so many thoughts that I needed something to organize them. So like this is inherently a catalog, and then I'm creating a catalog of like, here's a list of ways I've been done wrong.
Yeah.
um so yeah, that was a really long answer to what I think was a short question.
No, not at all. That's great. That was great. Yeah, and you expand it even further in a different direction also talking about animals in the idea of meat, right? Of feeling like meat, of being looked at like meat. And then you go into the gender politics of meat, which in particular stood out to me as a fascinating topic. So I know there's a lot to cover, but could you help us broadly connect the dots of our gender politics and meat consumption?
Yeah, I read a book by Carol J. Adams called The Sexual Politics of Meat. And was just it's a lot of it doesn't hold up. It's, it definitely leans into a gender binary that we know isn't real, and it's definitely leaning into like American and Western European understandings of gender and um, culture. Um, but I hadn't really put together that expression of like, oh, you're going to be dead meat, or like, what a weird,
Mm,
it's so redundant. Like, meat is dead. It's a
mm,
cool thing. Um, and what that meant about looking and the male gaze and like horror films and like what Mulvey said about gaze and this sort of like objectification of violence in bodies. I found all of that really, really interesting, and how that kind of there's a lot of really great indigenous scholarship that sort of looks at the way white people think about meat and vegetarianism, and the line is really this sort of like violence and power and control. And I was like there it is again, this sort of like way that this sort of like settler colonizer white patriarchal structure influences every aspect of culture, like even what we're eating.
mhm,
um, and it just kind of served as a reminder to like to not stop thinking about like, where did this come from and why am I feeling this way and where is the harm in that.
mhm,
um, so yeah, it's a really fascinating book to read and sort of think about now. Like I had it was so interesting to read that and hold on to her theories while reading like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which is all like
mm,
slaughterhouses of the early 20th century. And there's a
yeah.
lot of like gender and pregnancy loss and sexual assault. And so like that all seemed to fit in there. I reread Sarah Rose Etter's The Book of X, which is a contemporary novel about like women and bodies and disability, but it's an amazing book. The women in that novel live on a meat farm, so they harvest the meat from the ground. So there's no killing of animals, but there's still this sort of like violence of earth, and like the ground bleeds. So it's really interesting to think. I had never put those ideas together before, and now I feel like I've gone too far. I can't stop. But sort of thinking about like the never-ending ways that violence holds these things together, and then we just kind of move through the world with it.
Mhm,
So I've been doing a lot of thinking now about like reading more indigenous scholarship about hunting and meat and animals, and like the unity of thinking that is kind of missing from the white education that I have. So like Leanne Bettis, I'm going to say her last name wrong. I think it's Bettis.
Simpson.
Her I read a lot of her work. She has a new book out that's really excellent. Um, and just sort of like trying to retrain the way my brain is thinking about that.
Mhm. Yeah, really important. And this research led you to stop eating meat altogether, correct?
Yeah, yeah, I hadn't put that together with the neighbors, but that all did kind of happen at the same time. We had been reading about factory farming and just like the environmental repercussions of factory farming, and it just kind of all of a sudden I was like, I don't think we can do this anymore.
Mhm.
But looking back and like putting that on the timeline of what we were doing when we were living with the neighbors, it very much felt like there was so much violence out of our control that this was something that felt like we could do something more gentle inside our house
Mm.
and switch to a plant-based diet. So, I mean, it's hard to not find, I mean, I live in suburban Connecticut, so it's really hard for me to find ethically sourced
Yep.
meat that I could afford. It's
Yeah.
really expensive. And there aren't that many farms that do that out here.
Yeah. Yeah. Really, really interesting. And again, such important connections that you made. Well, we're coming to the end of our conversation, but before we wrap up, I'd love to turn to some action items, some suggestions that you might have for our listeners. And specifically, I'm curious what forms of support were the most meaningful for you when you were going through this really terrible experience, so that if people know someone who is going through something similar, they might know how to help.
Listening, I think. I was so afraid and like kind of weirdly ashamed of what we were living with, and I didn't really talk to anybody but my husband. So, but I think we created this kind of open way of thinking through these fears and what they meant to us that was really, really supportive. So I think, if anybody, I hope nobody goes through anything like this. But if you know somebody, it's just the act of listening and then believing.
Mm-hmm.
Without having to say like, well, I heard this story or in my experience, but just the space to talk about it openly and try to not couch the feeling of like allow the fear to exist without trying to diminish it, I think was really important.
Good. Good. That's great. That's great advice. Okay, my last question is where can we find a copy of your book? Again, the title is Human Animal, a Bestiary in Essays. I'd love to know where listeners can find it, and also how can people find you, maybe you social media handles or anywhere else that we can find the work that you do.
If anybody is interested, I would love, love, love if you would request it from your favorite independent bookseller or your local library. That is, I think, I mean, it's available on all of the major online places. The publisher directly is in Canada. They're Wilfrid Laurier University Press, and you could buy it from them too. But yeah, please request it from all of your favorite local spaces. And I am on bluesky at Amie Souza Reilly. And Amie is AMIE again, because my parents spelled it wrong. SOUZA, and Reilly is REILLY. And that's where most of I do my posting, and then my website is the same. So there's contact information in there.
Okay, awesome. And this will all be on the website as well in the show notes. But thank you so much, Amie Souza Reilly. Thank you for your book, and thanks for joining us today. It was just a fascinating conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This was fun.